Victory Day in the Russian world has finally arrived, with military parades taking place in cities all across Russia. Putin himself gave a speech in Moscow with national leaders from all over Central Asia present, saying that a real war has been unleashed against Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has responded to the Russian celebration of Victory Day by creating the new Ukrainian holiday of Europe Day, condemning the foreign leaders that attended the Moscow parade and making some uncomfortable statements about his displeasure with Ukraine's closest partners. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the feelings of victory for the Russian army remained just out of grasp. In the city of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian army themselves achieved a small moral victory by preventing the Russians from capturing the city before May 9th. However, Russians still control over 90% of the city, almost all of which has been captured since January of 2023. If this trend continues, Bakhmut will soon fall, and this small Ukrainian achievement will soon be forgotten. But as of today, May the 9th, the battle still rages and Bakhmut still holds. Meanwhile, in other parts of the battlefield, both sides continue probing attacks, and we have reports of increased missile strikes and bombings, more signs of extremely bloody summer campaign ahead of us. All of this in today's Frontline Report. What's up, my good friends? This is New World Economics with the 9th of May 2023 Frontline Report for the Russo-Ukrainian War. Before we get started, please consider hitting both that like and subscribe button, actions that are totally free for you but a big help for me to grow the channel. Before we get going, I would like to give a special thanks to Ed with the $50 donation, and a big thanks to Harvey Dent with a $200 donation.
I only have one question. Where is Harvey Dent? You know where Harvey is? You know who he is?
Holy shit, guys, I was not expecting this. Nobody feel like you should have to one-up these dudes. Honestly, between these two super chats and Steve's chat from yesterday, this is definitely enough to fund a special video. So if you guys want to reach out to me through email, we can discuss some kind of topic to cover that you guys can agree on. Hopefully you hear this message and you do just that. This morning, we started getting videos coming in from all across Russia where Victory Day parades are being held. All these parades are essentially military parades where units of Russian troops come out and they're, I guess you would say, they're dressed blues or, whatever. They're dress up their fancy uniforms. They march down the streets. A lot of old military equipment is brought out of storage, such as T-34s, which we're seeing in Moscow and several other places. Russia has a number of these T-34s that they use specifically for this occasion. They have enough of them where they can hold parades in all of the biggest cities across Russia. Some of them move around and do, several parades a day. In places like Moscow, you saw a little more unique stuff. There were Russian S-400 systems moving down the highway, or I guess it's technically Red Square, where this takes place, along with Iskander missile complexes and some larger strategic missile launchers that we're seeing. In the West, it's interesting when things like this happen. Rhetoric was kind of stepped up on both sides, both by Putin in his speech and by European and U.S. leaders today. And I kind of want to break that apart a little bit because, of course, events like this are always a good opportunity for your pro-Russian crowd and your pro-Ukrainian crowd to start arguing and, go at each other's throats. But essentially what's being said in Europe was, this was, an unnecessary demonstration of power. Like Russia is flirting with war by showing off all of these weapons and things like that. I think that's probably a misconception, a bad way to view it. Russia has this Victory Day parade every single year, and they always show off the same kind of stuff. Like it's just like it's like a seasonal traditional event where you're seeing like the newest Russian military equipment. Of course, it is a show of strength, but it wasn't any different this year than it was like 10 years ago when, there was no conflicts between the West and Russia, right? So, this definitely Europe taking an opportunity where more eyes are going to be on the television to, put out their point of view and put out their side propaganda. And it's the same thing with Vladimir Putin in his speech. A lot of people talk about how Putin is ramping up the rhetoric, and one of the big quotes from his speech was that the West was launching an all-out war against Russia, and the goal of the West was to destroy Russia. All this stuff. This isn't anything different from what he's been saying over the last year. It's just that this is an opportunity where he's going to be on camera, where more Russians are watching TV than traditionally would be, because it's a holiday. These parades are big events, so it's a chance for him to get that same message out there and boost support for the war effort. So that's why there's a lot of different propaganda on these things today. In the meantime, there is some, very interesting footage coming from these parades and stuff throughout Russia. Now, in terms of Zelensky, of course, this is also an opportunity for Zelensky to get his point across, and there was a lot of statements that came from him today. First off, Ukraine appears to be making May 9th. Of course, the Russians, this is something they complain about, but um, they complain about the fact that May 9th has been banned as a holiday inside Ukraine, like in terms of Victory Day. They say that this is kind of abandoning the past and saying that, it's a disgrace to all the different people in this part of the world that died fighting against the Nazis in World War II. Of course, for Ukraine, the main reason why they're doing this is they're trying to separate themselves from Russian culture. But still, you have to recognize that there are a number of veterans that speak both Russian and Ukrainian that are Ukrainian citizens, that still are alive and live in Ukraine and celebrate May 9th, especially children. So a lot of your pensioners and stuff were children of these soldiers. So their parents fought in the war and died in the war. So they have created a new holiday and they're calling it Europe Day. This is just what I'm reading on various channels online, and it's supposed to celebrate some symbolic connection between Ukraine and Europe, which of course is a huge goal of Ukraine's, is to move closer to Europe. Now, in terms of statements that Zelensky has directed at the Russians and at the national leaders that attended Victory Day, you had attendances by the president of Kazakhstan, basically all of Central Asia, so Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Belarus, and the only one that really didn't show up was Azerbaijan, and the Russians are claiming the reason why he didn't come was because it's also the birthday of the national lead, or I guess the national leader's father, who was also the national leader. I'm not exactly 100% sure. I don't know much about the president of Azerbaijan, and who his predecessor was at the moment. I guess I could do some research on it for you guys, but it just doesn't seem relevant. But that's being celebrated in Azerbaijan over the next 2 days. But that guy was invited. I wouldn't be surprised if that was just an excuse not to come, because Azerbaijan is also moving closer to Turkey and hence closer to NATO as well. But all these other guys, including Lukashenko from Belarus, were there, and Ukraine, or Zelensky, said that basically these guys showing up in Moscow for their parade was a great offense to the Ukrainian people. It was an attack on the Ukrainian people. Essentially, what he's saying is like, by doing friendly things to Russia, that means you're doing unfriendly things for Ukraine, which isn't necessarily true. Like, some of these countries have their own problems with Russia. It's just a big event. And a lot of these countries also have veterans or children of veterans that fought in what Russia calls the Great Patriotic War as well. So, you have to remember that the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and all these people were in the Soviet Union at the time. So, their grandfathers were drafted into the Red Army and fought the Germans as well. So, um, just a bit of wartime rhetoric there. But one thing I want to cover real quick, that's kind of very interesting is some statements that Zelensky made against some of their closest partners in NATO, that being Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, for the most part, and this might extend to Lithuania and Latvia, Estonia as well. But these countries that border Ukraine, these four countries have banned imports of grain from Ukraine into their country and other agricultural products. So sunflower oil and maize and corn and other things like that as well. And the main reason being is these are all big agricultural producers as well. And in my opinion, if the populations of these countries are to be kept happy and keep supporting Ukraine in the war, then they can't piss off the farmers. And that's a big problem in Poland. Like similar to the Netherlands, you've seen some farmers' protests in Poland, protesting the import of Ukrainian grain. What they're saying it does is like the Ukrainian grain is a lot cheaper because Ukraine's a poor country. Their farmers are willing to sell it at a lower price. So that floods the Polish market with a lot of these things, and it puts Polish farmers out of business. And it can make Polish farmers have some animosity against Ukraine. So, that could result in some kind of drop in support. So, in my opinion, this is, obviously a big economic issue for these countries. They can't allow their farming populations to suffer at the expense of supporting Ukraine, which is something that they want to do. Outside of Hungary, all these countries are trying to give as much support to Ukraine as possible. And to me, this is a weird one because in order to keep supporting Ukraine, they probably have to at least act to their citizens like, well, like our, Romanians come first, then Ukrainians, or Poles come first, then Ukrainians, but Ukrainians are second, so like they have to at least signal to their citizens that they're looking out for them. In the meantime, Ukraine, of course, is going to be upset about this because they are trying to get rid of their grain. That way they could, get some hard cash in exchange. That cash is very much needed for the Ukrainian budget, for the Ukrainian war effort. Of course, I'm going to get to this in a second. This is another big thing, but Ukraine doesn't have a lot of different paths to get income from international trade at the moment. Grain trade is a big one. So, Zelensky, rightfully so, is like, hey, you can't block this grain. We need it to keep fighting the war. The Poles, the Romanians, the Slovaks, they're all saying, well, we can't let you sell your grain here because that is going to hurt our population. And then, we might get voted out of office and you might not get enough support for the war anyways. So, it is a tricky situation. I'm sure they'll find themselves out of it somehow, like whether it's like just moving Ukrainian grain through these countries to sell inside of Germany and France and Italy. Perhaps that might be the move, and just not letting them stop and enter into these markets. So who knows? We'll see what happens with that. In terms of the grain deal, which this is the other factor here, the grain deal that the UN brokered between the Turks, the Ukrainians, and the Russians to allow Ukrainian civilian grain ships in and out of Odessa to sell their grain to the international markets, under the supervision of the Turkish Navy, essentially. So what's going on is these grain ships are being inspected on the way in and out to make sure they don't have any kind of weapons that could be used from the war on them. But that grain deal is expiring, and Russia is not going to re-sign that grain deal. So after May 18th, there's going to be a huge question on whether Ukraine can safely ship their grain in and out of Odessa. Now, Peter Zion, the geopolitical strategist, has put out a video on this very recently.
We've seen significant improvements in Ukrainian air defense to the point that over 90% of the missiles and drones that the Russians have been firing in have not been able to hit their targets, which is great if you are in Ukraine because they've been targeting the power grid. However, once it becomes apparent that the Ukrainians are going to move, and once it becomes apparent that the weather is warm enough that targeting the power sector isn't going to kill any civilians in Ukraine, the Russians are going to switch their targets to facilities that are more difficult to defend, and that is the agricultural supply chain system. So on the 18th, there is a deal that lapses. The Turks and the United Nations have brokered a deal between Ukraine and Russia that allows civilian bulk trade shipping vessels to get into Ukrainian ports after being searched by the Russians, load up with Ukrainian corn, wheat, sunflower, and other stuff, and they get re-inspected on their way out just to make sure that they're not smuggling anything in, such as, say, weapons. The Russians have been warning for weeks, if not months, that they're backing away from the deal, and they're definitely not going to be renewing it next week when it becomes up for renewal, because they need to switch target sets. In the past, they've gone for the power grid because that's how you kill people in Ukraine in the winter, but once you get to summer, you have to starve them. And this is probably going to be the end of meaningful agricultural exports from Ukraine. They're going to go for ships, they're going to go for ports, they're going to go for loading facilities, they're going to go for cold chain systems, they're going to go for silos and storage facilities, and of course any place that builds or maintains agricultural equipment. This stuff is a lot more dispersed, it's a lot harder to defend. It's not like just putting a bunch of air defense around a city, and you're going to have a lot more target hits because of it. But that's how this is going to go.
And so I partially, I both agree and disagree with him. Of course, Peter Zion is an American like myself, and he's rooting for the American side and all this. Which I don't blame him. I still think he's a smart guy. I think one thing that he gets kind of wrong, which might be it's not necessarily wrong, because like he says that Russia is targeting, has been with missile strikes targeting Ukraine's power sector. That does kill people. And, Russia switching to targeting Ukraine's grain and agricultural sector, that will also kill people. But I don't, he portrays that as the motivation behind doing that. I think the motivation behind targeting those things is targeting Ukraine's income and making it harder for them to fight the war. They're targeting the economy, because before Ukraine's power sector started getting hit by Russian missiles, they were making a lot of money, not enough money to cover the war effort, but a lot of money by selling their excess power generation and energy to the EU. So they can't make that money anymore. They're not doing that anymore. Maybe a little bit, but they really only have enough power and energy infrastructure to keep the lights on in places like Kyiv and Odessa and the Dnieper River Valley and Lviv. So they don't have a lot of extra there they can make money off of. In terms of grain, yes, like if Russia starts targeting the grain, then people will end up dying in Ukraine from starvation and stuff. At the same time, that is an income stream for Ukraine that Russia is going after. So now, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the Russians have a problem with killing civilians, because I don't think they do at all. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I think the main motivation behind going after these things is targeting the pocketbook of Ukraine. Energy and agriculture being the two biggest things that they make money off of. So I do think that Zan makes a good point in saying that Russia after May might start hitting grain silos. I can see that happening. It's a very interesting assessment, but that's my thoughts on that. So we'll look out for that in the future to see if Odessa starts there's an increase in missile attacks there, and he's definitely got a good point about how a lot of these grain silos and collection points aren't going to have air defense around them, so they'll make for much easier targets for the Russians. Now we are going to go ahead and talk about Bakhmut to round out the video here. Battles are still raging. basically in all the areas that are left in the city. You have the two flanks, Ivanivsky and Hromove, which are holding so far. And then you have the Citadel, the southern flank, which is really being anchored down by a couple high-rise buildings down here. And then you have the residential neighborhood and the Olympic school. So I think we can zoom in a little bit further here to that neighborhood. We do have some Russian gains that I had not marked yesterday. They have taken over a little bit more of that Olympic school, including the post office. And we do see some kind of movement for the Russian side to try to go in this direction and cut off this Ukrainian position. So once this stronghold right here ends up falling, the Russians don't really have far to go to reach this intersection right here. Okay, so this is the big problem with them moving in this direction. As you zoom in, you see there's not as many houses, there's not as much cover. Once the Russians move up to some of these positions, like right here, you could start to assume that they'll have direct fire coverage over this direction here and completely cut off use of supply from this way. So we know that the Ukrainians aren't currently using the 0506 road entirely for supply. They're probably using part of it and then going off road at this point. This a couple day period, which might be over already, but a couple day period where it seems like the fields and roads are somewhat dry. They're probably moving off road. Coming into Kromove here through a back way, as well as using this road that comes in from Ivanivsky. So once the Russians move into, say, this area, and then they can start trying to capture this dam here where this lake is, or really, I guess, the ground that they need is technically on this side right here. So this is the ground. I'm sorry, guys, I'm clicking the wrong buttons. This is the ground that the Ukrainians have to worry about, because if the Russians take this, then essentially there's no possible way for the Ukrainians to get supplies into this citadel area, which will be the end of Bakhmut. So that is the direction that the Russians are moving. It's an easier direction to move into rather than going into this high-rise district right here, where there's a ton of Ukrainian defensive possibilities and positions. So I think that is it in terms of the frontline updates. We can zoom out real quick and look at where the Russian assault activity has been over the last day or so. Pretty similar to, what has been in the last couple of weeks. A lot of activity in Bakhmut, activity on the ring around Donetsk, and some activity in the area of Seversk. All right, guys, that's it from me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.